Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is episode number 22, and this is the final show of our first License to Lead podcast season. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Lynn Elliott, who is here to help put a bow on this season wrap-up. You met Lynn in episode 10, and Lynn's always behind the scenes, working to bring this podcast to life and to get our newsletter out to everyone every 2 weeks. In this episode, Lynn and I plan to answer some challenging questions from listeners, and then ultimately, we're going to wrap up the whole kit and caboodle by letting you know what to expect in season 2 of the podcast. Lynn, welcome. It's just great to be sharing the mic with you.
Hey, Patty. I'm happy to join you, and I'm excited about this episode. We discussed as we made plans for this season wrap-up that we would focus on the audience, that we were going to have a chance to listen to our audience. I think we also thought that the season wrap-up could include a bit of an overview, kind of the arc of the first season on the podcast.
Great. And do you have a sense of how we might go about the arc? What do you think?
I thought about the season and I saw this wrap up as an opportunity to remind listeners what the beginning was. And that was really the setting of the foundation and why you were doing License to Lead and the fact that physicians aren't leading healthcare, and that we see that it's going to be better for everyone, physicians, for staff, for patients, and everyone, if physicians are in more leadership roles, if physicians are leading healthcare. And you brought so much data and evidence to those first podcasts that you did on your own. And then we shifted into interviews, and you've brought on so many different, interesting voices to the podcast. And I saw them as some trailblazers, people who were firsts in many of their areas of leadership. And there were leaders who using data to make their case for change. And we listened to guests overcome limiting beliefs and just challenge themselves to see something in a different way. Dr. Obitz talked about emergency physicians don't mind tinkering with things. So some of our guests use small tests of change as the first step to get in action with their leadership or changing something in their organization. And we also heard some of your guests being very driven by patient quality and patient safety. So those were some of the themes that I saw in the interview section. Another goal with the podcast is really to engage the audience. We want to reach more people with this podcast than we can when we go into organizations and work with a single leadership team or do one-on-one coaching. Those, I think, are some goals of this season wrap-up.
That is great. I love that you created that clarity about the division from the initial podcasts where I was fully unleashing my perfectionism and diving into the data relentlessly, digging out as much information as I could on the whole topic of physician leadership. Honestly, Lynn, I think that some of the docs that we talked to really got pushed to the edge. They were done with a way of working that wasn't serving them and wasn't serving their patients. We certainly heard that from Dr. Jen Lentz and heard it from former AMA president, Dr. Barbara McEnany. She just saw how it should be and was exceedingly motivated to make things right and to create the kind of work environment that was going to work for her and for her oncology patients. She was such an advocate for her patients. That same story applies to me. I reached a point where it was important that things either change or I would bail out. I was going to leave the organization I was in, and that motivated me to get involved in leadership. And in some ways, I think the same thing motivated us to look for this broader platform of a podcast because we didn't feel like we were making enough of a difference, reaching enough physicians, enough people in healthcare with the approach that you and I have taken for many years, which is contracting with organizations and medical groups and healthcare systems or advocacy groups as we did out in Washington, D.C., and working organization by organization. And so we wanted to get a lot of this information out there on a broader level. That had us turn towards podcasts as a platform that could reach more people with information about how important it is for docs to be leading in healthcare. You made the distinction between the first set of podcasts. And I would really love to point the listeners towards the first 3 podcasts as the foundational 3 that makes the case for why physicians should be leading and draws that real contrast between medicine and the medical profession versus other so-called traditional professions. The fact that in those other traditional professions, the professionals are leading the organizations. And that clarity and alignment is hugely important and utterly missing in medicine because physicians are only leading about 6% of healthcare organizations, a tiny minority. In law, engineering, architecture, the clergy, those professionals are leading the vast majority of their organizations. And in a way, I really want to push physicians to think about these issues to stir up some of that militance that we saw both in my history of getting involved and that we've seen in the backgrounds of a lot of the guests that we've had, where they see that there's a gap, there's an issue, and they're motivated to take it on. If there's an underlying reason for the tone and a lot of the content, it's my drive to get physicians to take it on, to get them to create the kind of career and healthcare system for themselves and for patients that they love and that they can engage in and enjoy and do their very best work.
Well, and I think sometimes the clients that we work with and some of the guests too, it's not easy to go back and talk about the time when you were pushed to the edge. All of those stories didn't necessarily get surfaced. Feeling disgusted with the system and taking a new job can seem so risky, but we've seen people move to other systems and other roles. And that feeling of getting unleashed, like they get out of those constraints that they were working under, either by changing position or changing organizations. And that can seem so risky, but has such a big payoff. And we know those stories. It would be great, I think, in the next season to surface more stories like that.
And I think that's an important, sensitive point. Some of our guests who had similar stories but did not want to name a previous organization. I think I'm super sensitive to any of that. I'm not here to make anybody regret anything they ever said on the podcast. I'm probably more cautious than my guests even would require me to be. Yeah, there were stories that we are privy to about people who were not treated well and their extraordinary skills and traits were not acknowledged or appreciated, and really created a lot of, trauma, created
shame. I mean, I think that people get embarrassed. They're ashamed that their career looks the way it does and it's not satisfying. And you talked about that some in the last couple podcasts.
It's a whole nother, certainly a whole nother series of episodes talking about what goes on in organizations and with careers. If the main goal is profits, people are commodities and there's no attention paid to how people are let go or if people are humiliated or shamed. More reason for us to make a difference and to get the professionals leading the organizations.
What do you think about then a segue into the feedback that we've received? That was one of our goals, to engage a larger audience. And we have actually been getting feedback both in email and voicemail messages, and we wanted to share some of those.
Yep, I think that would be terrific. Let's go there.
Right. So via email, we got a question from a listener who said, I'll quote the email, "I'm not involved in healthcare or medicine with my work, but I'm involved in teams. And I'm wondering, what advice do you have for someone who's interested in transforming their workplace or really doing a great job in human resources and doing the best possible thing for your team?" It's a great question because certainly all the leadership work we do translates to other organizations, non-healthcare related organizations. And we talk about having a healthy organizational culture, and that's important in every organization.
This question makes me think about the important intersection between what leaders do that make them excellent leaders and what people in an organization need in order to be engaged. And in episode 8 with Scott Smith, we spent some time talking about a model by Mary Beth O'Neill, where she talks about the 3 things that effective leaders do in an organization. And it's communicating the territory, in other words, setting the vision, explaining what's going on in the environment, and it's creating excellent teams and supporting those teams, knocking down barriers for those teams. And then the third thing is holding people accountable. So making sure that you're results oriented and people are held accountable. And then the things that we know about what creates engagement, I always lean on Gallup. The Gallup top 6 really describes those elements of employee engagement that are the most linked to business outcomes. So do I know what's expected of me at work? That's clarity. And do I have what I need in order to do my work? And do I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day? And then the last 3 really are all related more to belonging and recognition. And so I think to combine those is also a great way of sizing up what you need in any kind of organization. So it doesn't have to be healthcare. We've certainly used this information in other industries. So to really think about what the leadership is doing and kind of mapping it to some of those elements that Mary Beth O'Neill describes, and then going right to the Gallup work to understand if the people in the organization have what they need, have clarity, and can bring their best talents to work and have a sense of belonging. So that's a broad brush response to this listener's email.
And so if we wanted to give them something more specific, we could talk about meetings and evaluating the meetings you have in your organization as a way to improve your organizational culture. And so in any organization, not just healthcare, what is going on in the meetings? Do people even show up for the meetings? Are action items identified and are they clear? And what is the follow-up process? And we talk about if you're in an organization where meetings are very amicable and people are very quiet, that's probably not tapping into what people really have to bring. And we talk about creating safe space for healthy debate. You want activity. You want people raising all kinds of different ideas. We get great feedback from our clients when they just introduce an agenda template and they send the agenda out in advance. So doing those pieces around meetings for better communication can do so much to reduce threat and create a more open environment.
It's such a great example of something that just does not get the attention or respect that it deserves. You mentioned the agenda template that we use and that we share widely. It contains these other elements, and that's the magic of it. And so it's all captured on the expectations that are created just by having a template for the meeting to start with. And I don't think anybody listening to this is going to be at all surprised to hear that we endlessly run into organizations and high-powered leaders who have for years been winging it and creating meetings that makes everybody roll their eyes. So many people look for reasons to not go to the meeting. And what we like to say is you want to run a meeting that nobody is going to miss. People don't want to miss that meeting because that's where the action is. That's where work is actually done and you reach outcomes. If you're in an organization where the meetings are agony, it's just such a huge problem. By the biggest definition of what a meeting is, it's when 2 or more people meet. That's a meeting. And so what else is there in an organization except meetings?
Right.
You know, whether you're coaching one-on-one or you're running a huge town hall, these are all meetings. Such a great example of something that's the subject of all kinds of Dilbert cartoon strips, but can be the most important thing that a leader does.
Right. And so when we talk about meetings, we often are talking about ways to think about how people might be feeling threat how people might be going into those meetings and being afraid of being caught off guard or being called out in a meeting, or as you were describing, someone dominating a meeting. And all of those create more threat. And we wanted to mention the free resource that we offer on the website that anybody can go and download. And it goes back to CARB, which we've talked about many times. But this guide walks through all 4 interpersonal motivators, and it's a tool to use to think about how you might create more safety and have a less threatening work environment. And so you just go to the website, fakeconsulting.com, homepage, you enter your name and email, and you can download the guide.
Right. And CARB being clarity, autonomy, respect, and belonging. You mentioned that if everybody is amicable and sitting around quietly in a meeting, that it's not a healthy sign. And I think there's even the more dire situation where everybody is really quiet and you can sort of feel the fear. Mm-hmm. And you know that there is a sniper in the room. And so whether the sniper is the leader of the meeting or a buddy of the leader, you know that there's somebody in the room who makes it unsafe to speak up in that meeting. In that case, you've got these people that you likely spent a lot of time hiring, getting the best people in the room, and you're not hearing from them. They're not free to use their talent and creativity because they are in a threat state. All of those things have to be addressed, and it all relates to meetings.
Shall we go to another message?
Yes.
So this was an email from a physician. Hey, Patty, I loved the episode on the scribes. My question that was not addressed in the episode was, how was the cost covered? So I was wondering if you discovered how everyone else was footing the bill on the scribes. We all understand the improved efficiency, less doctor burnout, et cetera, but who pays?
Yeah, that's an important question. And I reached back out to Dr. Mark Lucarelli to just get a little bit more clarity on this. I also looked online to see about any other data. And the truth is there's a lot of different approaches. In some situations, the physicians are paying out of pocket. In some situations, a system is footing this bill. In other organizations, the medical group will cover these costs. And in some situations, there's some mix of this or some expectations put on the physicians. We'll provide the scribe, and we have A, B, and C expectations. And Dr. Lucarelli said that they agreed to increase the number of patients that they saw by 1 patient per half day. And this was very easy to do with the massive benefit that the scribe provided. And he said at UW Health, the scribe program was introduced as part of a physician wellness initiative. So the intention was all about improving the physician's workday. It was definitely not all about getting more productivity out of the physicians.
I think it goes back to the values. I was fascinated to get that response from Dr. Lucarelli, that it was a part of a wellness initiative. I mean, you've talked so much about wellness initiatives being, it's not a retreat. It's not yoga. It's not healthy snacks in vending machines. I think we talked about it. Couldn't scribes be part of the wellness initiatives? And there it is right there at UW.
Yeah, such a fantastic point. I mean, right on. That's it. I think that there was an expectation that there'd be such a benefit from this that the physicians would see more patients during the day. And it sounds like it played out that way. But at the heart of it, this was all about improving the workday, making the workday tolerable, making it perhaps enjoyable. And that's what we've heard, is that the scribe program at UW Health has so improved the work lives for the physicians that we spoke to.
Dr. Lucarelli was also one of those physicians before he had a scribe, was at a point where he didn't know if he could continue to practice at the rate because he was seeing so many patients and doing so much documentation.
Right. Yeah, he talked about how he was disappointed to realize that he was at the peak of his career as an oculoplastic surgeon and really at the peak of his skill level and not really being able to imagine continuing in this career. And the scribes changed all of that. And he talks through that, like you said, in the podcast.
That was episode 16, Scribes.
Great. And I know that in other systems that the physicians themselves pay out of pocket if they want to have a scribe. So that's, one end of the spectrum. And we heard from Dr. Obitz, the CEO and president of Emergency Care Consultants up in Minneapolis, that the scribe program, which he launched, was part of the organization itself. They saw it as a necessity to make sure that the physicians would be able to be interacting with the patients optimally, and that it would be a huge part of providing high quality of care. And of course, physician engagement and physician work life comes right after patient quality of care, I think, as far as their value system. So you pointing to the values, I think, is just huge, Lynn. It's such a critical point. There's a lot of different ways to pay for scribes. So much of how they're set up and how they are paid for has to do with the values of the organization.
You usually have a point of view that comes through on an episode. And one of the things we want to do in this episode is encourage feedback and comments. And we did get an email from someone who was a little concerned about offending you. Do you want me to share the remarks that he made?
Yeah, it'd be super if you wanted to let us know some of the concerns that he expressed.
Right. Well, so you might want to speak to, he thought the good old days were not maybe so good. And there was a lot of waste and repetition of work before the EHR, and that doctors were sort of expected to have all the answers. It wasn't a very good team-based approach. And he said, in the good old days, doctors were not that revered. We were taught to be paternalistic. And the attitude was that the patient was to submit to the orders of the clinicians. If you want to speak to any of that.
Absolutely. One of the elements of that episode that this listener took away that he didn't like was the vilification, as he interpreted it, of the EHR. And I think that's really important. And it's, to tell you the truth, always just a little bit in the back of my mind when I talk about the EHR. God knows I live and breathe on my multiple electronic devices and cannot imagine healthcare. How ludicrous would that be if we didn't have things captured electronically? With so many of these things that he brought up, we are in violent agreement. But the point is, I think the important point is that it wasn't clear to him, that was true, and that my perspective wasn't clear, and that there wasn't a balance in the way it was presented. I think that is obviously accurate because that's how he experienced it. And so, yeah, I love hearing this because it will drive me to be a little bit more careful about what am I vilifying? I'm vilifying an EHR that is not physician and patient and user friendly. You can just read about how other professions and industries are brought into the technological and electronic world, and it really serves those organizations. It greases the skids. It helps everybody. It serves them. And I think that was the promise with the EHR, and especially the 500-pound gorilla Epic EHR. And that promise missed the mark, I would say. And that's what I want to vilify. And that might not be a good enough answer, because this listener might actually think that Epic itself doesn't deserve to be vilified. And so that's something that I'll find out when I go back and forth with him a little bit more. We plan to have a phone call. What you mentioned about the good old days, I don't have any interest in going back. The challenge for me is really to be balanced so that there's a better understanding of the vision that I'm trying to create in this podcast. And what I'm interested in is creating something new. Really, there's no reason to go back or look back except to not do it again. And I think that we're all about what can be created, and what can be created in healthcare and in medicine that at least is on par and parallel to advantages that have accrued to other professional organizations and professions with the advent of more technology. And how can we at least be served by technology as well as other professions?
Another point this listener made was around primary care. And it's hard to summarize, but the facts that primary care really didn't exist initially. Sick care was what medicine provided. And as primary care has evolved, the systems around primary care aren't set up well.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to summarize. This was a long, thoughtful email, and we'll come back to some of these points in a future podcast because I think it really warrants that. It covers a lot of topics about population health, the electronic medical record, and primary care, and it's great fodder for a podcast.
That's terrific. Well, I think it would make sense to move on to a couple other messages that were left on our SpeakPipe voicemail app.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fun for you and me to be able to hear the voices of people who are listening to the podcast.
Okay, let's listen to this first message.
Hi, Dr. Faye, longtime fan here and avid podcast listener. I have a question for you. So you've convinced me that physician leadership is needed, but does the bottom line business mentality need to be changed before the physician leader comes in? And if not, how do you get the physician into that position of leadership?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. It seems like it's the, chicken and egg question. If we've got this business school mindset, a, profits more than patients mindset out there in a lot of healthcare organizations, how do we get physicians into positions of leadership? And a few strategies that come to mind. One is, of course, the reason for this podcast, which is increasing awareness to this issue and bringing some data to the issue so that people start going, oh, yeah, okay, this is different than other professions. And oh, yeah, this might not be serving healthcare and medicine and patients. To have this managerialism mindset that comes from the business schools, having its fingerprints and more than its fingerprints all over healthcare and all over our medical profession. And so getting that awareness out there, I think actually surfacing models of excellent leadership where it's working and why it's working, and encouraging our younger listeners, younger physicians, and those in medical school to be having more of these conversations. And of course, I don't mean to be patronizing with that comment. They're having these conversations. And so we're here to help support that and bring as much scaffolding, I guess, to that conversation as we possibly can. And we're bringing exemplary leaders, having them on the podcast as guests so they can describe how they've moved into positions of leadership and what they see. I remember the comment by Amanda Goodall. She talked about don't pick the first person that raises their hand for a position of leadership. And this is true whether it's a business person, a non-physician, or in any other industry. Don't take the person wildly waving their hand, because with their other hand, they're probably shoving really highly qualified, humble people aside. There's a big problem with narcissists in positions of leadership. And there's some great work done by Jeffrey Pfeffer on this topic, and a recent publication about how there's kind of a wonderful match between typical characteristics of narcissists and the characteristics that people tend to look for in leaders. And so this is really a bug in the human system, in our psyche, that we would have such a tendency, I think, to promote people with narcissistic traits because it's extraordinarily damaging. And so I think that's a big part of this answer as well, is really understanding the traits of leaders and what actually works. What is the evidence for their effectiveness? Not that they're exuberant and somehow they're the guy that got on the golf cart with the CEO and the chairman of the board. Not those traits. Does this person have, a swath of direct reports who love them and will, walk through walls for them? And do they have great organizational outcomes? And do the people around them, especially their colleagues, their direct reports, and people who have no influence in the organization, do those people love this individual? Those features will pretty much rule out a narcissist taking over and ruining your organization. So that understanding is huge.
You often will say people will go where they're invited and feel welcome. And that points to having conversations with people who are potential leaders and encouraging them to step into leadership roles. When you see qualities in people that are valuable, when you see their leadership qualities demonstrated, that you reach out to people. As a leader, you reach out and develop other people who you think would make excellent leaders. You need to invite people to participate and not just count on only those people who will raise their hand.
Absolutely. And you mentioned how critical this is as a leader, or if you're in a leadership position or on a board, to make sure to notice and reach out and invite people into leadership programs and invite them to consider leadership roles that they perhaps are not raising their hand for. The person who really is desperate to be the boss of you and me is most likely the last person on earth that you and I would want in that position of leadership. I think the other element that is just huge when it comes to responding to this question about chicken and egg, do you change the organization first and get rid of the business school mindset, or do you get a physician leader in there first? I think it's so much about the board of directors. And a lot of people don't recognize that necessarily. So making sure that the board of directors understands what the organization needs, understands things about the candidates for leadership. I wouldn't even be able to describe how many times we've heard from people saying, you have got to be kidding. They put so-and-so into this position of leadership. Did they not ask anybody? So much is known about an individual and their undesirable traits. And the board of directors relies on professional search organizations. They're very motivated to get somebody into that position so they can collect their fee. And the board of directors really needs to have the information to get the right person into place. How about anybody listening? Send this podcast, send them episodes 1, 2, and 3, and have them think about who are they going to choose for their next leader of the organization, and bring your big fat opinions to the board of directors, please. Even better, get on the board of directors and bring your big fat opinions to the CEO selection process. That'd be really optimal. And Lynn, we got another speak pipe recording from a physician who had a comment about episode number 3, and that's the one that was titled, Who Are the Masters of Healthcare? And that is about the MBAs and business schools. And I'll play Dr. Sinha. Here he comes.
Hey, Dr. Fay, it's Dr. Sinha. Had the pleasure of taking your course. Enjoyed your podcast on Who Are the Masters of Healthcare, and it's very interesting. And I'd love to talk to you about it sometime. A lot of stuff that Mintzberg talks about, I have opposing views about. So when you have some time, we'll have a chat. Hope you're well. You can text me anytime.
I appreciate this call from Dr. Sinha, and I gave him a call and we talked. And his concern was that there were some advantages, at least in his career, to getting an MBA. So he thought it was critical for physicians to be at the table and not on the menu. And he wanted to be able to participate in a meaningful way, understand the language, understand the tools. And for him, that meant that he had to get an MBA. And this may be back in 2006. And so we talked about that. And my biggest complaint is the ideology of the MBA program. But on the physician's behalf, I don't worry about physicians absorbing that ideology. My concern for physicians is the enormous expense of time and or money to do this when they could be actually solving problems within the organization and building relationships by reaching out to people for their just-in-time information. It does sound like he gained information that was of benefit to him, specifically around some of the financial tools. Part of my interest is to let it be known that there are other approaches without such a huge investment when there are a limited number of tools or pieces of information that are actually needed from within that MBA program. I think about Dr. Barbara McEnany, former president of the AMA, who said she took a night accounting class and that did the trick for her. What I've encouraged some of the physician leaders who I coach to do is to reach out to the CFO, or if their CFO is prickly, to find somebody who has financial expertise for their just-in-time information.
What we also know is that women are more susceptible to this belief that they need more training to be qualified for the next leadership role. So I would just double down on this for women, just to pursue supplementing their education in the ways you just described.
Yep. And we need more women and people of color in leadership positions. We know that data is out there as well.
Another way we get questions that we thought would be valuable to share with listeners is when we're in front of groups, and you were in front of a group of physicians in London where Professor Amanda Goodall is the course director. She had you come in and talk a little bit with the physicians and field questions. They had some great questions, and they were very related to performance issues. And so one question was, when there are problems in a department, how do you identify a toxic physician? And I think, Patty, you had used that phrase, a toxic physician. And they were like, well, how do you identify that?
Yeah. And I think maybe a little bit of an underlying concern with this individual who raised this question was a concern about whether I was labeling somebody as a toxic or a disruptive physician versus perhaps somebody who's looking to provide an alternative opinion. And I love that. I mean, I love that distinction. It's so critical. It's like a weed is a flower out of place. I'm sure that I was a disruptive physician at one point in my career, and my decision was to get involved and to bring my opinions to a higher level because they were not accepted. And so what I would say is that it's important to look at the individual's behaviors, what they say, what they get done, what's really going on with the individual. So I think somebody who has legitimate concerns, there are problems in the organization, and they're never subtle. These are not subtle things. It's usually poor leadership and poor outcomes and poor organizational culture. So if you've got that kind of situation and you've got a naysayer who is describing the issues and bringing data and perhaps, stretch goal, even bringing some solutions and getting involved and kind of sticking their neck out, I think that individual is somebody who deserves the benefit of the doubt and perhaps a leadership role at some point. Interviews can be very helpful. I can remember getting a call from a union leader once about a physician, and this union leader, she demanded that this physician be fired. And I'd kind of only heard good things about this very outspoken, self-assured, confident, self-promoting physician leader. So I did not know her well. And so I went out and I interviewed everybody in the department. And lo and behold, half the staff was out on leave and looking for other roles elsewhere. And the other highly qualified, fantastic physician in that department was looking for other work. They had a superb administrator in that department who couldn't do anything with this physician. So I interviewed everybody in the department one-on-one. This is when I was in a VP role. They didn't really know me, but they trusted me with their thoughts. We put this person on a work improvement plan, which she abjectly failed, told me that perhaps I should be on the work improvement plan. And we fired her. I think this person's question is really important. So somebody's not toxic or disruptive because they disagree with a leader. That would not be the definition by any stretch. But somebody who is harming the department and harming outcomes, harming the organizational culture, creating very, very quiet meetings, they warrant being labeled as disruptive, and it needs to be investigated. The harm done is huge when somebody like that is allowed to have their way with a department or with an organization.
Super. And then someone went on to ask, what if your boss is the toxic person? What do you do?
Yeah, I think one of our favorite presentations that you and I have done and worked on is arrange to have a great boss. This is accomplished in a number of different ways. But if your boss is toxic, it means that you as an individual, you're not going to be able to bring your best to work. You're not going to be able to be there for your teammates, for your direct reports, and certainly not for your patients. So how do you arrange to have a great boss? Sometimes you have to leave the organization or leave the team, look for other work. Sometimes you can be the one who surfaces the reality of what's going on with that person and brings it to other higher ups. It might mean that you lobby to take your boss's job. And another thing that we like to talk about is the importance of creating a cone of protection where you, in your perhaps middle management position or whatever your leadership role is, you're taking the brunt of this toxic boss's behavior, but you protect your team and protect the people around you so that you create a great culture. It reminds me of what Amanda Goodall said in in the interview with her and in her research, and she talked about the umbrella effect, which she sees with, what she calls expert leadership. She has the TEL, the theory of expert leadership. But basically, people who are experts in the core business are much more likely to create this umbrella effect. And I'd say it's probably what I call the cone of protection. An expert in the core business will know what's needed by their team and their direct reports, and will do whatever they can to protect them because they're focused on forwarding their profession and their professional goals. And that is served by this team. If you're not an expert in the core business, if you're an administrator with no particular attachments to the profession, you're more likely to be beholden to the person above you. You're more likely to be concerned about the politics as opposed to the profession. You might not be throwing your team or others under the bus, but you're maybe walking away from them and the bus rolls over them. So you're less likely to be dedicated to protecting the people who are serving the profession that you've basically spent your entire life in.
Super. So again, we were talking about performance management, and then someone asked the question about performance management can seem kind of harsh. And how can you balance some compassion with your performance management?
I think that it's critical to be compassionate. So even in the process of identifying the fact that somebody is not a fit in the organization and need to leave the organization, what else could require more compassion than that if you really understand the impact that that's going to have on the individual? I would also say, I've made this point a few times, but in the vast majority of cases, if you've got somebody on your team or in your organization and they're not a good fit, they're requiring somehow performance management, it's leadership's fault, so to speak. Who brought them into the organization? Who recruited this person? Who allowed them to get to this level and be unsuccessful? In the vast majority of cases, that person is in the organization in the first place because of poor leadership decisions, or they've been promoted because of poor leadership decisions. So of course, compassion is needed. I think sadly, people that don't do well with performance management, and this is painfully common, they have to demonize the individual on their team that they're going to fire. They have to demonize them to justify their own discomfort with terminating them. And that, I think, is, that borders on evil.
Something you said in there too, Patty, was about people being promoted into roles, being selected to take on roles. And if they are then in those new roles without support, like without then getting leadership orientation or some leadership development program, or they're in this new position without a coach, that can be something that the organization does to support the leader. And then without it, it is leaving that person, without any skills, without any defense. How are they supposed to succeed without also then getting something they need to be successful in that role?
Yes, such a fantastic point, Lynn. In some ways, I think it applies even more so to physicians in organizations who are most often expected to continue their 1.2 FTE work as a physician and aren't given any support or any direction. And I believe some of this is because the role itself is disingenuous. The role itself is a figurehead or a patsy for an administrator, or it's somebody that's put in place to kind of CYA because the physicians are supposed to be making the decisions about quality or about various things within the organization based on the corporate practice of medicine. I think often CMOs are in the position of being kind of the patsy for a leadership team and having to nod their head and agree to things. And they aren't really equipped to be a physician leader. And in some cases are in that position precisely because they're unlikely to assert themselves in the way that would promote the profession of medicine and promote what's most needed by the patients. I think making sure that anybody who's promoted or just even brought into the organization in a role on a team gets the support that they need to be successful. The idea should be that the person was hired well, so of course they're going to be successful. And if they aren't, I would love for the leaders and managers to feel absolutely accountable that they have made a mistake if they're not able to support this new hire, new leader to be successful. And with all that said, well, we invariably make the point when we're talking about performance management and teaching some of these approaches that a leader has to be ready to be wrong. They've got to be prepped to recognize that they did not get the right data. They did not get all of the information. They got information from a biased party, whatever it might be. When they march into a room to have a tough conversation, they absolutely have to be ready to be wrong and to be able to say, I have made a mistake. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't have that information. I apologize. And we've both seen this go so haywire when somebody in the organization has an agenda and they steer an individual towards leadership with accusations that the person, has done this or that, or they're disruptive. The person, HR, marches into the room and it doesn't matter what they hear. It doesn't matter what additional information they get. They follow through on disciplinary measures. And when we talk about what's coming up next season, let's circle back to that one because that will be huge.
Great. Well, Patty, some of what we thought about doing too is sharing some perspectives from listeners who are really appreciating the podcast. How about I read some of the comments that have come in to give people a sense of how the podcast informs and influences listeners?
That would be lovely.
So someone wrote in, what an outstanding podcast. I will definitely be listening to the rest. And it's even more enjoyable since I've had the pleasure of working with you, taking your courses. What I wasn't expecting was the great outline of what sets physicians apart from other healthcare workers by the definition of professional. I'm doing a presentation tomorrow about our credentialing committee, and I'm borrowing the importance of autonomy and professionalism.
It's so gratifying to know that people can actually use the information. They're taking it and running with it. I think that's terrific.
Right. Someone wrote in, I love what you're doing and can't agree more with the foundation and the premise of your work. And they say, I'll sign up for the podcasts. Yes, we want people to sign up for them or subscribe to our newsletter. That's another way you're sure to know what's coming from us. And you get each podcast release in the newsletter. I liked this one. This listener said, what a powerful resonant focus you've taken with your work on this. Jandel was fabulous, so real, clear-eyed, and purposeful. Many thanks for the work to make this happen and for sharing your thinking with the world.
Yeah, boy, isn't that's, I don't do very well taking compliments, do I? It's like,
well, this one was great too. A patient wrote in after hearing the interview with Dr. Lentz. This patient says, excellent interview. I was a patient of Dr. L before the DPC practice and stayed with her when she opened her new practice. It's amazing to have this much access to your doctor. Also, the level of trust I have in her is only due to all the time we've spent. She knows I'm skeptical of all medical professionals in general, and the DPC model has allowed me to ask a lot of questions, challenge things, and learn what's right for me. I loved the interview for the insight into the journey she and her family went through. It was fascinating.
That is fantastic. And DPC is direct primary care for listeners who may not know that. And Lynn, we also got a comment on the newsletter. Somebody wrote, this reads beautifully, fun, and professional. This is so exciting. I would love to share this with some Alaskan physicians. I thought especially of Ann Zink when I read this too, but I know she's still insanely busy dealing with COVID in Alaska. This seems like such important work. And I had to pluck that one out, Lynn, because I am such an Ann Zink fan. So she is this masterful physician leader in Alaska who got herself on the map with her calm, cool, professional, and thoroughly informed updates and responses to the COVID crisis. Cool.
That's great. Well, that I think covers the questions and the comments we wanted to share in this episode. We also wanted to give people a sense of what's coming up in the next season. So do you want to speak to that?
Yes, we will definitely talk about private equity issues. This is something that has come up repeatedly from listeners, prompting me to take this on, and I'm exceedingly interested in it. We are going to continue to talk to leaders who have figured out how to overcome the huge barriers to getting involved in leadership and taking on the organizational and cultural change that needs to be taken on. Because, we know, and you've pointed this out, Lynn, people hear us issue this plea that they do what they can to change the medical profession and change the way healthcare is delivered. And it's not clear to them how to do it or what their role is in doing it. And so a big push for us will always be to bring leaders onto the podcast who have found ways to make a difference and make a change. And they found their ways in. The ways into it are varied and so important for people to figure out what they most need and love and what will really fulfill them, and then find their way in through that route. We'll continue to pursue conversations with physician leaders and others who have figured out a way in order to, spark some ideas for listeners. Mm-hmm. And you and I have an enormous quantity of material that we've developed over the years around physician leadership and transformation of organizational culture. And it's always been called nuts and bolts and very practical. We're going to introduce that content on the podcast as well. And this is a most direct hit to what you said at the beginning, Lynn, when you mentioned that we really wanted to take our information, our ideas to a broader audience. This is what we teach. And when we coach, it's what we share with our coachees. And when we work with leadership teams, it's invariably what we bring to the leadership teams. And it's nuts and bolts, practical ideas about running meetings, like we talked about earlier, performance management, recruiting, which I call selection, approaches to coaching and courageous conversations.
Another thing that we bring into organizations are change management tools. So really practical approaches that leaders can have around communicating change, planning for change, executing change.
Absolutely. And of course, the neuroscience of leadership is more of an underpinning model that we use when we talk about almost any of the work that we do when we work with physicians and other healthcare leaders.
As we think about wrapping up this episode, Patty, there were a couple of things we want to remind listeners that we want to hear their concerns and we want to hear their ideas for podcasts. So send your ideas to us. And if you know of a great leader we should talk to, let us know. We want to be sure people know how to subscribe to the newsletter. And you can do that by going to the website, fayconsulting.com. And we do want you to share episodes with people you think would really benefit from hearing them. So we even got this question from a listener saying, I love listening to your episodes. Could I share this with my physician leadership team? So we said, yes, absolutely. Share the episode.
Yes. And on that note, with that listener asking if they could share the episode, to which, of course, we give a resounding yes, there was another person who wrote in and said, I would love to hear if there are ways to be meaningfully involved in this initiative to make a difference to the delivery of healthcare. And I guess I would link that comment to the previous question about sharing it. Do what you can to help promote the License to Lead podcast, send it to people, ask them to take a listen, let them know what it is about the issues that are of concern to you and what you would like to see changed. And use the podcast any way you can and sign up for our newsletter. That's the Podcast Plus. In the newsletter, we notify you of each new episode. So it's every 2 weeks. And we give you a bunch of additional information as well. And we try to make them kind of fun.
And Patty, we have had a couple of people reach out and say, could I share this episode with a class, for example? And of course, that would be great. We also would love to talk to audiences in a live setting. That's another way to work with us.
Lynn and I are both extroverts, and we really value the chance to interact with people. And it really puts both of us in fine form if we have a chance to go back and forth with people who have questions and challenges. That is a sweet spot. So this has been really fun. So perfect to have you on the podcast, sharing the space in this wrap-up episode. And I look forward to many more in the future.
Me too, Patty. It was great. It was a lot of fun.
Yep. Thanks. That's a wrap on season 1 of the License to Lead podcast. To stay informed about next season's guests and content, watch for our every 2-week License to Lead newsletter. And if you don't yet receive our newsletter, sign up for it on the Fay Consulting website. As a sampling of what season 2 will look like, we plan to address hot topics such as the private equity takeover of entire fields of medicine. We'll dive into the legal issues of physicians being directed or managed by non-physicians, and we'll try to answer, how did we get so far afield from what used to be the almost universal corporate practice of medicine statutes? As I mentioned in this podcast, we'll be sure to circle back to talk about how people are treated in dysfunctional organizations. A big part of season 2 will be interviews with physician leaders, and I'll also bring some of the leadership development content that we teach. If the License to Lead podcast is useful to you, sign up for our newsletter, rate the podcast, and write us a review. And above all, I really mean this, send us some feedback and ideas. We need to hear voices back from the void. And as always, thank you very much for all of your care and caring.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.